I can't remember the exact date. It must have been in the summer though, because the afternoon was unbearably hot. I don't like walking my dogs at that time because I can't and will never live knowing that they are burning their paws on the ground. Thus, I decided to go right before sunset. Everything is cool, and plus, I would get to see the beautiful paintbrush marks in the sky. For me, it was a win-win. It was my usual route, and there is a ton of dog walkers during this time. But instead, it was eerily quiet. You could drop a pin and it would sound like an explosion. That type of quiet. I'm a girl, and my number one rule is to never have both earphones in. I watch too many true crime YouTube videos, and I'm a very cynical person. So, I tend to be cautious, almost anxiety-driven. Halfway through my walk, I hear a truck. Its tires crunching against the dirt, slowing its pace. I turn over. I was in front of a driveway, so I quickly sped so as to not be in front of it. But instead of turning into the driveway, it kept going and it stopped again. And my heart started racing, pounding like the rhythm of a drum. It got even faster when I noticed the guy in the car rolled down the window. Cute dogs you got there. I sighed a breath of relief. My dogs are cute, solid 10 out of 10s. It wasn't unusual for people to compliment them. I said thank you and continued walking. I almost laughed. I felt so dumb in that moment. Until I heard these screeching tires. It sounded like they went 15 to 100 in 3 seconds flat. I was so startled that I flinched. I whipped my head back to see that he had parked right behind me. And then I heard the very familiar click of a car door unlocking. I immediately tried to start booking it to my house. Keyword is tried. One of my dogs didn't feel like running, so she stopped and fought against me. She was tugging against me so hard, her collar slowly started to slip off. I picked her up, and right as I did, I saw both his feet touch the ground. I ran. When he saw me running, he immediately got back into the truck and started it up again. I couldn't tell if he was following me, but I wasn't going to stop to find out. I have never ran that fast in my life. I have horrible stamina, so I can't run for more than 2 minutes before my body starts giving up. I ran so hard when I got home that my whole body was aching. I ran into the house almost crying. A few family members were there, so I took my mom aside and told her about it. And when we came back out, I looked outside and saw his truck going up and down the neighborhood. I didn't walk the dogs for about a month after that. I hope that guy wasn't successful in kidnapping some other person that day. I, a 23-year-old female, grew up in a rural area in Ontario. It was the kind of place where you never lock the doors because you know everyone in town. The all-too-trusting, small-town mentality stayed with me once I moved to a big city for university. I got an apartment in a student area with a college nearby, and plenty of bars within walking distance. I lived with a guy friend, Roddy, who was a few years older than me from the same small town. I would go to the bars with friends on the weekends and stumble home by myself around 2 a.m. One night on my way home, my neighbor Kyle and I met in the hallway, both headed to our own places. He was also drunk and so good looking. He said hello and invited me inside. I ended up staying the night with him. He was nice and it was a fun night, if not a little awkward. We didn't trade phone numbers and it didn't seem like we cared for anything to come out of it. So I went home in the morning and that was that. Fast forward 2 days later. I was asleep in my bed and my roommate was half asleep on the couch with the TV on. He heard a sound that might have been the door creaking open, but he ignored it in his tired state. A few minutes later, he opened his eyes to see a naked man standing in front of him, lifeless and staring into his eyes. It was Kyle. Roddy tried to talk to him and ask him what he was doing here, but he didn't respond. Roddy ran to my room and said, I think Kyle is here to see you. So I followed him out into the living room and saw a completely naked Kyle, staring at us with the most serious and concentrated eyes I had ever seen. I tried to talk to him and asked him to leave, but once again, he didn't respond. Instead, he went into our kitchen and he opened the fridge, and proceeded to take our butter out and start smearing it all over his face and chest, saying nothing, and still with a completely serious look on his face. Roddy and I ran to my bedroom to talk about what to do. While we were in my room, Kyle walked down the dark hallway that led to us and stood in the dark, right before the lights in my room could reach him. All you could see was his silhouette, and he started whispering my name over and over. Roddy and I ended up calling the police and staying in my room until they came, and took him back to his house. They said that he must have been on drugs or something, but he probably wasn't a threat. I agreed that I didn't think he was a threat, but I didn't sleep well that night knowing he was a very thin wall away from us in his apartment. Just an update. I talked to Kyle about a week later and he had no memory of doing this, but he did call 911 on himself and got an ambulance to the hospital in the next morning because he had severe sunstroke. So it was likely a sunstroke-induced delirium. He's okay now, thankfully. Another time, we forgot to lock our doors and I was at work and Roddy was at home. I got a text from him that said, "Please get home. Someone is here and I think you must know them because I don't." And so I took an early lunch and came home to see what was going on. There was a man with greasy black hair so long that it nearly touched his elbows, and he was pacing back and forth in our living room. Before I even got a chance to speak to him, I realized that he was not mentally present. He would alternate between screaming at the top of his lungs like he was being murdered, and then he would cry and say things like, "I can feel the pain and suffering of everyone in the world. I can hear the voices of the poor and tormented in my brain, begging me to help them. I can't stand this suffering. Nobody understands my powers and ability to know what everyone is thinking." I would chime in to politely ask, "Do you know where you are? Or, what is your address and can I help you get home?" And then he would scream at us because this was his house and he wasn't leaving, and he wanted us to stop judging him. After about 10 minutes of him rambling and pacing, he said his address to us, which is actually the neighboring apartment. It's where Kyle lives. I knew Kyle had a roommate that I met, John, but apparently this was their third roommate. I went to his door and knocked, and thankfully, the roommate John opened the door and came to retrieve the rambling man. Later that night, John knocked on our door and I opened it to see him holding a bottle of wine. He wanted to thank us for handling the situation well and making sure that he got home. Apparently the man had recently been in a mental hospital and left on his own accord, and he had walked into the wrong apartment. His parents came and got him and he's back in the hospital, safe and sound. All in all though, I think my neighbors are pretty weird. Well, let's call her Sam. All throughout high school and even for a bit afterwards, we were best friends. Even though we were best friends, I felt like I didn't really know her, if that makes sense. We were pretty wild teenagers, drinking, smoking, hanging out with older guys, I know, etc. Sam always dated super sketchy guys. When we were 16, Sam started dating a 27-year-old named John. It's disgusting, I know. I had my fair share of dating guys that were way too old for me as well, though I didn't see anything really wrong with it. Also, predators have a special way of making you feel like there's nothing wrong with what they're doing. I had my fair share of trauma due to older men from that time in my life, but that's a story for another time. Sam didn't have a card at the time, so she would normally ask me to drop her off at his place to hang out, and cover for her if her mom ever contacted me, because this relationship was obviously hidden from her mother. Being an idiot teenager, I was like, yeah, sure, whatever. She's my girl and I know that she would do the same for me. Plus, I had met John several times before that and he seemed decent enough at the time. Please keep in mind that I was also a teenager at the time and obviously, I realized that he wasn't. He would give us alcohol and stuff and would invite us over to party with his equally disgusting friends. Their relationship seemed fine at first, but it turned toxic within a few months. I mean, duh, he was a grown man manipulating a little girl. He would constantly demand to track her phone location and control what she wore. He also cheated on her multiple times, but she would always stay. During the time this happened, I stopped driving her to see him. One time, she called me begging me to drive her to see him, and I said no. She went on to explain that he was drunk, and if I wouldn't, then he would pick her up, and if they got in a crash due to drunk driving, it would be my fault. So I drove her to his house. I was furious with John at this point for hurting my best friend, and had a rebellious, teenage, give-no-cares attitude. So as soon as I walked into his house to drop Sam off, I started screaming at him for being so manipulative towards her. His response and the dark, twisted yet emotionless look in his eyes still gives me chills to this day. I could break your neck so easily. Thankfully, I was standing right in front of the front door, so I ran to my car and immediately sped off. The next couple of years are kind of funny. Also, I asked Sam to stop talking about John because I was sick of hearing about him. But basically, they were constantly breaking up and getting back together. Sam dated a string of other guys, but would always cheat on them with John. When we were 18, this is when things started getting progressively weirder, and I started to distance myself from Sam because of it. Long story short, Sam had a new boyfriend who seemed crazy about, and I was so relieved because she finally seemed over John. And then she heard through the grapevine that John got engaged, and she became irate. We were hanging out when she heard the news, and she was like, I have to go home and process this. So she immediately left, and I was like, whatever, I'll give her her space. She calls me a few hours later and was talking super fast and laughing a lot. I was like, are you good? And she was like, yeah, I just broke into John's apartment and smashed all of his stuff. I know that I have this new guy I'm dating, but I've been hooking up with John still. Don't hate me, and I'm sorry that I didn't tell you. But anyway, I feel so great I broke his TV and cut up all his sheets. Too bad John and his fiancée weren't home. I had never seen her act like this before, and I was alarmed. What would she have done if they were home? The break-in was never reported to the police because she told John that it was her. And if he went to the police, John's fiancée likely would have found out that he was cheating on her with Sam. Now at this point, a smart person would completely cut her off. But I didn't. I stopped hanging out with her as much, and we naturally grew a bit distant because I had moved across the country for college. But we would text and FaceTime every couple of weeks. So, at this point, you're probably thinking, okay, so what about the murder? Hang on tight, we're about there. In 2018, John's fiancée was found dead. The police immediately ruled it as a self-death because there was a note and the gun was found in her hand. But all of her friends and family insisted that she would never do that. I know this because I had a few mutual friends with his fiancée, and it was understandably all that anyone could talk about. She was known to everyone as being extremely positive and cheerful. They had pressured the cops to investigate more, and lo and behold, 1 year later, John was found guilty of murdering her. He's currently in prison, and it chills me to the bone knowing that I was in his house on multiple occasions and I used to frequently hang out with him. So now, moving on to why I think my best friend may have had something to do with it. Last year, she was visiting my city and asked to meet up for dinner. I was like, sure, why not? We're gonna be in public and I do miss her and it'd be nice to catch up. While we were at dinner, she had her phone on the table and I saw a call from the name Jail ringing into her phone. She quickly excused herself to take the call and was gone for a couple of minutes. When she got back, I was like, oh, what the heck? She explained that she visits John in prison normally and they talk on the phone every day. I was like, why? He was found guilty of murder. Why would you want anything to do with him? And she looked me dead in the eyes with a look of pure evil and malice and said, I'm the only one who knows what actually happened. Nobody else knows the truth. I quickly changed the subject and finished my dinner really quickly and made an excuse to leave. I was terrified at this point and had no idea what she was capable of. I hightailed it back to my apartment and I blocked her on everything. I haven't spoken to her since. I know this isn't solid proof that she was involved, but her past behavior at the break-in, coupled with that chilling comment, and the fact that she visited a convicted murderer in prison, leads me to believe that she had something to do with it. At the very least, she knows much more than she's admitting. I only had sleep paralysis during 2 periods of my life, and both were when I was under extreme stress in my home life. Once was when I was an early teen. My mother had remarried a very bad man, and that was when I first experienced sleep paralysis. For several months, it was basically different variations of the same hallucination. So, this is the only one I remember from that time. I would wake up feeling very panicked. My heart would be racing, breathing short, and I couldn't move or make a sound, and I had an absolute feeling of fear. I don't know why, but I just knew that someone was staring at me. So, I would look around the room and I would spot him. It was the same man every time. A bald, wide-eyed man. I could only ever see the top of his head down to the arch of his nose, but never the end of his nose. And he could be anywhere. If my blinds weren't pulled all the way, I could see him staring at me from outside my window on the 2nd floor. If my door was slightly cracked, I would see him peering at me sideways from outside the door. If the closet door was open, he would be in the closet. Under my sister's bed that was across the room from me, inside the vents, at the foot of my bed, and even sometimes inches away from my own face at the edge of my bed, just staring at me. I was too panicked. I couldn't move, and I felt like if I made a noise or moved, that was when he would do something, though I never knew what. I remember being scared to sleep at night. I slept a lot in class and could only sleep comfortably during the day. Oddly, I'm on night shift now, and really, I only sleep during the day. I don't remember when those ended, but my mother did divorce that man when he showed an unusual interest in my sister. I went years without sleep paralysis. I had never expected it to come back, but then it did, right at the tail end of my failing marriage. We had gotten together in high school and were together for 11 years, but I didn't experience these problems until the last few. At that time, I didn't realize that I was under stress. I always justified everything that was irritating me and would power through my problems, but doing that made me physically ill. My stress symptoms started as sleep paralysis. I think because I was more mature and rational than my hallucinations were no longer a phantom man that could show up anywhere, but as a very real threat that could happen. In the dreams, I would wake up to the sound of very light metal scratching. It was the sound of someone picking the lock to my front door. At this time, I would start to panic and try to wake up my spouse, but I couldn't. Even if I tried my hardest to scream, it would only come out as a muffled whine in my throat. I could hear the intruder very slowly turn the knob and open the door, exactly how it would sound if someone was trying to be quiet. But it was exactly the same sound my door actually makes. I could hear the person slowly creep around my house, opening other doors. I could even hear the sound of their clothes rubbing. It was so realistic. Eventually, they would get to my door and I couldn't do anything. I could only wait to see if they would come or not. Sometimes the person would come in and sometimes they wouldn't. Sometimes they would bend down to peek under the fairly large gap that my bedroom door had at the bottom. Even though I had similar dreams multiple times, it was impossible to talk myself down from the fear. I started developing other stress symptoms later. Panic attacks were the only scary one. I actually went and got my heart examined because I thought there was something wrong with it. I started having problems with my memory. I would lose odd chunks of memory. Sometimes I would obsessively organize something as though I couldn't move on with my day if it wasn't perfect. Later, I finally developed depression where I couldn't seem to control my emotions. No matter how much I tried to rationalize that everything was fine. This went on for about 2 years until a coworker who had gone to another job came back briefly, saw me and was shocked by how I had changed. The other people around me had been there the whole time, so the gradual change in my behavior and character wasn't noticeable to them. But to him, it was a very shocking change. I'd become very pessimistic and even slightly aggressive. He was the first person to recommend that I seek a therapist, and he seemed genuinely worried about me, and so I did. Unfortunately, the psychologist almost immediately handed me over to a psychiatrist, who started prescribing me medications. I really didn't enjoy being on them. I wasn't aggressive anymore, but I also wasn't happy either. I was numb. I felt like I was faking my emotions so that people wouldn't realize that I was abnormal. I thought that I would have to forever be abnormal and faking happiness and laughter. I would still occasionally get the panic attacks and my memory issues became worse. I would forget things I said moments ago and get lost, going places that I had been hundreds of times. Eventually, my husband and I did get divorced, and one day, a year after my divorce, I was sitting there and I realized that I was better. I hadn't been taking my medication because it was making me make mistakes at work, but there were no repercussions. I wasn't having depression, I wasn't having sleep paralysis, panic attacks, and aside from just being a bit of a normal dingbat, I wasn't losing chunks of memory. It was a very strange realization. It's been about 7 years since then, and none of those problems ever came back. I still have very mild anxiety, but it doesn't affect my life at all, aside from keeping a sleeping bag in my trunk and locking the windows and doors before bed. Sometimes I think about those days and I'm amazed just how sick stress made me.